Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to continue our study of the book of Nehemiah. We are going to begin the study of chapter 2 today. We completed chapter 1 with the tefillah, the prayer that Nehemiah said before God before he entered into the king in order to ask the king for help and permission to begin rebuilding Jerusalem. This was after Nehemiah had received the news that, unfortunately, the building had been stopped in Jerusalem, and the people were downtrodden, and the building had stopped, and the walls of Jerusalem were in disrepair and falling apart, and the gates were burnt, etc. Nehemiah prayed to God, confessed before God, and asked God for favor in the eyes of the king when he presents himself before the king. Now, it is, as we read chapter 2, I want to make a few points that will help portray the picture of what's going on over here. This king is Artexerxes, who he said is King Artexerxes. The father of Artexerxes was another famous king named Ahasuerus. And I made that point last time, the famous king from the book of Esther. The similarities between what we find happening and the echoes of the story of Esther abound in this chapter 2 and in other chapters in this book of Nehemiah. And it's clearly not coincidental. One thing we find is Artexerxes was the king who supported Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign. He gave Ezra permission to go up to Jerusalem and build and so on. Now it's the 20th year. So in between the 7th and the 20th year, the people in Jerusalem, led by Tovel and other of the Samaritans and other groups that opposed the Jews building, had sent a letter back to Artaxerxes convincing him, which ultimately convinced him to put a halt to the building. And now by his 20th year, we have the episode that's about to take place where Nehemiah is about to ask the king again for permission to start building again. Does this remind you? I assume it does remind you a little, especially with those familiar with the Purim story, of the king Ahasuerus, who was constantly changing his mind based on whatever the advisors in front of him seemed to convince him to do. Nehemiah clearly knew and understood this, especially Nehemiah being the one who served the king wine. That was his job in the court. He knew what it was like to ply the king with a little bit of wine and get him to say what it was that you wanted him to say. Now, Artexerxes, and this is an intriguing suggestion, although it's hard to know this for sure, could have been the son of Queen Esther. He may have actually been halachically Jewish himself, having had a Jewish mother, Queen Esther, because Artaxerxes' father was Ahasuerus, which leads some of the traditional commentators to identify Artaxerxes as the same person as Darius, because in various traditions, Darius is mentioned as the son of Esther. Now, historically and chronologically, it doesn't work out very well, and I'm going with the chronology that works better. So Darius and Artaxerxes are clearly not the same person, and which fits into the chronology of everything we've been learning until now, that Darius was one king, and then after that was Artaxerxes, was Artaxerxes. Now, after Darius was Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes, Xerxes being Ahasuerus. Now, let's begin reading Nehemiah. Now remember, Nehemiah heard the news, the bad news from Israel, during the month of Kislev, during the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. We're about to read proof of that the calendar keeping that the Jews kept in the days of Nehemiah in the early Second Temple was the same way we keep our calendar today. Because as we keep our calendar today, the Jewish calendar works, when we count the months and state which is the first month, second month, third month, we count from Nisan. Nisan being the first month, which is the month of the year in which Passover falls out. When we number the years, we number them based on Tishrei, which is Rosh Hashanah, the new year, is when we number the next year. So in the month of Kislev was when Nehemiah heard the news. He prayed and fasted for what was the month of Kislev, part of the month of Kislev, Tevet, Shevat, and Adar, the ending of that year. And then when Nisan rolled around, Vayihi b'chodesh Nisan, this is verse 1, chapter 2, was in the month of Nisan, Shnas Esrim, in the 20th year. So when Nisan started, this is still part of the 20th year because the year is clearly being counted from Tishrei. The Artexerxes HaMelech, in the 20th year of the reign of Artexerxes the king, Yain Lefanov, there was wine before him. This should be conjuring up some images of Achashverosh, Artexerxes' father, when his Tov Lev HaMelech Bayoyin. Remember the Megillat Esther from the book of Esther. And I raised the wine, V'etnol HaMelech, I gave him to drink. V'lo hayisi ra lefanov. And I was not, literally, Lara means bad. I mean, I didn't have a sad countenance. I didn't look sad in front of the king. Now, the way that, even though it seems to be said in present tense, the real meaning of this phrase here is that usually when I brought wine to the king, I was in a happy mood. You don't want to come to the king's party and ruin the mood of the party. The king would not be very happy with you if you did that. Nehemiah said it was understood that it was part of his job to be happy, to come to the king with a smile on his face, in a good mood, and give the king wine to drink. But all of a sudden now, the king noticed that something wasn't right with Nehemiah this time. And remember, Nehemiah is coming in with a plan. And he is very upset. He was just fasting and praying for several months because of the bad news he heard from Jerusalem. Vayomer li HaMelech, the king said to me, Madua ponecha ra'im? Why do you have such a sad face? Why do you look so forlorn? V'ato eincha chola, you're not ill. You know, you don't look like, maybe you're physically sick, but you don't look sick. You just look sad. Ein zekim ro alev. There must be something going on in your heart. Something's bothering you. Now, by kings, especially the Persian kings, but most kings, when something's up that they don't sense, they automatically think somebody's trying to rebel. Somebody has a plan. So therefore, Nehemiah, when he heard those words from the king, says, and I was there very afraid. I was trembling with fear. Remember how Nehemiah prayed to God to be seen by the king in favor, but now the king is now acting a little suspicious. What's wrong? What's wrong? Is there something up? The king wants to know. V'omar lamelech, and I said to the king, Hamelech l'olam yichya, may the king live forever. Madua lo yeru panai. How could it be that my face could not be sad? Asher ha'ir beit kivrot avotai chareva, the city among where my forefathers are buried, my ancestors are from, is destroyed. Usha'area uchlu ba'esh, the gates of my city have been destroyed in flame. Does this remind you of Esther at the king's party when the king had wine and Esther said, my nation is suffering? Note that Nehemiah and Esther both did not say the name of their nation when he said this. Nehemiah is just saying, I, as a friend of the king, right? I as the special, high officer of the king, my city, the city where my ancestors lie, is in destruction and ruins. He did not mention the name of the city because remember, this king had, we don't know exactly how long, but several years prior, had written a decree about Jerusalem because Jerusalem was this capital that always rebelled. Vayomer li HaMelech al ma ze atom mivakesh. What is it then that you are asking from me? What do you want me to do about it? Right? So your city is, okay, so you're sad, but clearly you want to ask me something. What is it that you want to ask me about it? Immediately I prayed, and clearly this prayer is in his heart. He's not standing in front of the king and praying to God, but this means I prayed in my heart to God immediately that I should have the wisdom to say the right thing. This is my moment. Here's my moment. These words, again, very reminiscent of the Megillat Esther, where Esther used those exact same words. If it is good for the king, and if this servant, your servant, is good in front of you, in other words, you look at me and you think, yes, I am a good servant, I've been a faithful servant for all this time, Asher tishlacheni el Yehuda, I want you to send me to Judea, El Ir Kivrot Avotai, to the city where my forefathers are buried, V'avnena. He did not, and I will rebuild it. Let me be in charge of the rebuilding effort. Nehemiah, in a very fascinating way, understood that he needed to take control of the rebuilding effort. He couldn't just ask for a decree and then have this decree be rescinded and then another decree be rescinded and so on and so forth. Nehemiah felt that if he could be the man on the ground leading this effort, that he could pull it off. He just needs support from the king. But what's clear here is he says, send me to Judea, which is a province, but he doesn't say which city is going to be rebuilt. He doesn't say to the city Jerusalem, because that might tip the king off. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that's that rebellious place. But no, he said to the Ir Kivrot Avosai, Vayomer li HaMelech, and the king said to me. And here we have a word that's used that is actually a very coarse word. It'd be Hashegal, and the Shegal, Yoshevetz Eslo, she was sitting next to him. The Shegal, that term is a term that means it means sex, and it's a very coarse word. And in fact, when we read the Tochacha, when we read parts of the Torah, when the Torah uses that term, we actually change what we read in order to read something more respectful. The pasuk here deliberately uses the term in order to paint a picture of what kind of a person this king was, and so that you understand that his concubine, who is there simply for his sexual gratification, was sitting next to him at this party. So you can only try to draw that picture in your mind, and why the Torah doesn't use the Hamalka, the queen, or Pilag Sho, his concubine, but he uses his sex accompaniment was sitting next to him at the time. So just to paint that picture, Nehemiah wants to paint a picture of just how base of a human being this person was. Now, he's drunk, he has his consort next to him, and what does he say? He says, Ad Mosayim Alochacha, until when are you going to be there? How long are you going to be there for? When are you coming back? It was okay in front of the king. The king thought well of his plan. I gave him a timeline. I gave him a schedule. I said, I'm going to go, I'm going to come. And then the king was okay with the plan. But this is not enough. Nehemiah knows that in the Persian Empire, if you don't have a letter, right, and for those that recall the book of Esther, it's the same thing. If you don't have a letter supporting you, then you might as well not have anything. It has to be written down. If it's not written down, it's useless. So I said to the king, Im halamelach tov, again the same language. Igrot yitnuli, the king should give me letters of introduction, letters of support. Al pachvot ever hanar, letters that will be addressed to the officers of all the various provinces in the land across the Euphrates River, which is the land that includes, of course, the province of Judea, the province of Samaria, which is the big enemy to Judea now. All those guys that are making trouble, that earlier petitioned the king to stop the Jews from building, I need letters of introduction to them, Asher Ya'aviruni, so that they should allow me to pass, to come on my mission. Ad Asher Avo El Yehuda, until I get to Judea, and there I'll be among the Judeans, and I can begin my mission. And then, even more important, this is verse 8, V'igeres el Asaf Shomer HaPardes, I definitely need a special letter to Asaf, who is in charge of the Pardes, Asher Lamalach. The Pardes is like a garden or a sometimes I've seen it translated as a park that the king owns. In other words, it's an area of land in Judea that in which the king's which is the king's park, the king's garden, and it is a place where, and Asaph is in charge of it, and I need supplies from him. Asher yitin li eitzim, that he can give me wood, likaros, for beams, ashari habira, in order to place beams on into the gates of the capital. The gates are the big doorways that would close and and protect the city and open to allow people in and out. Asher Labayis, and for those gates that lead to the house. He didn't specify that this house was the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, but he says that are needed for the house, Uluchomat Ha'ir, and for the walls of the city, V'labayet Asher Avayilav, and the special house, the temple that I will come to. Vayitin li HaMelech, and the king gave me Ki Yad Elohai HaTova Alai. And here Nehemiah recognizes that what the king gives me is because just like the generous hand of God that's being generous to me. So in other words, Nehemiah recognizes, of course, that what the king is doing is being done by the grace of God himself. Va'avo el pachavot ever hanar. Now, let me remind you, remember, if you recall back Ezra in chapter 7, when he got permission from Artexerxes to go, he gave the king a whole speech about how great the Lord of heaven is, how great the God of Israel is, and how he's going to, by building a temple to the God, how great it's going to be for the king. And then Ezra gathered all the people together, got his permission from the king, but he never asked the king for a military escort. He never asked the king for soldiers. Ezra then had to pray. Remember, Ezra said, I was embarrassed, right? Ezra said, I was embarrassed. After telling the king how great and strong God is, I couldn't go to the king and say, now I need soldiers. What do you need soldiers for? The greatest, strongest God in the world is going to lead you. So Ezra had to pray that God protected his caravan as he brought them to Israel. Nehemiah, on the other hand, tried a completely different tack. Nehemiah understood that he was up against enemies. And if he comes with an armed escort of soldiers, number one, he can be protected against those enemies. And number two, with such a show of force, he can show them that the king is really behind them. Nehemiah, when he beseeched the king, he didn't give him a whole speech about how great God is. He took a personal route, just like Esther did. And he said, personally, I am a faithful servant of yours. I have always been a faithful servant of yours. All I'm asking is to honor my family, my ancestors, and the city in which they lie. Please let me go and rebuild it. So when he came, as Nehemiah said, when he traveled and he came to the Pachavot Evar, to the leaders of all the provinces across the river, I was able to show them the letters of support that I had from the king. And the king did send with me officers of the army and chariots and riders protecting me. So I had a full entourage, a military entourage from the Persian king himself, leading me into the farther out provinces of Persia as I went on my trip to Judea. This, I'm going to end here. This is Nehemiah 2a, the first part of chapter 2. We will continue chapter 2b next. Thank you so much for studying Nehemiah chapter 2a together with me. Looking forward to studying the rest of this chapter together.